In the summer of 1870, Europe stepped onto a bridge it could not retreat from. Two powers, France and Prussia, moved toward each other with the heavy certainty of fate. What followed would not only redraw borders, it would redraw identities. It would end an empire, crown another, and leave behind a wound so deep that generations would feel it ache. At the center of the gathering storm stood Otto von Bismarck, Prussia's chancellor, a conservative statesman with a mind built for leverage and inevitability. He had watched Prussia defeat Austria in 1866 and knew what that victory meant. Prussia had become the leading German power, and France, long accustomed to being Europe's gravitational center, felt the balance shifting beneath its feet. Yet the spark was not fired on a battlefield. It was struck in the quiet, combustible realm of dynasties and diplomacy. Spain's throne had been left vacant after Queen Isabella II was deposed in 1868, when Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, related to the Prussian royal house, was persuaded to accept the candidacy in June 1870. France saw a nightmare taking shape. Prussia to the east, a Hohenzollern linked Spain to the south, and French influence squeezed between them. Under diplomatic pressure, Leopold withdrew. But the French government demanded more, an assurance that no Hohenzollern would ever again be put forward for the Spanish crown. King Wilhelm I refused to give a permanent promise under duress. The tense exchange at the spa town of Ems was reported back in a telegram. Bismarck took that account and edited it, tightening the language, sharpening the edges, then published it on July 14th. The Ems dispatch landed like a slap heard across Europe. It stoked outrage in Paris and inflamed pride in the German states. Bismarck got what he wanted, a provocation that made France furious enough to declare war. On July 19, 1870, Napoleon III did exactly that. He did it believing a victory would restore his weakening authority at home. He did it believing France could win. French confidence was not baseless. They trusted in recent reforms, in the breech-loading chassepot rifle issued across the army, and in the mitrailleuse, an early machine gun whose rapid fire seemed to promise a modern edge. French generals, blinded by national pride, expected a short and glorious campaign. But war does not reward confidence. It rewards preparation. Bismarck saw the conflict as the final mechanism of unification. If France could be made to look like the aggressor, the southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and others, would rally to Prussia. They did. German numbers swelled, and with them came a decisive advantage, a general staff that could move armies like clockwork. The contrast was brutal. Germany mobilized efficiently, delivering vast forces into the forward zone within days, while French mobilization faltered with delays and confusion. Soon the war became a chain of reversals for France. On August 6, 1870, French forces were checked at Wörth. Retreat followed. Near Saarbrücken, Marshal Bazaine fell back toward Metz, only to be struck at Mars-la-Tour and Gravelotte in mid-August, and then sealed behind Metz's defenses. The French tried to undo the disaster. Marshal MacMahon moved with Napoleon III to relieve Bazaine. Instead, they were encircled at Sedan. On September 2, 1870, the Second Empire's fate collapsed into a single unbearable fact. Napoleon III surrendered. More than 100,000 French officers and men were taken prisoner, including the Emperor himself. The symbolic heart of the regime was captured in broad daylight. When Paris learned the news, the empire fell. On September 4th, the Third Republic was proclaimed, and a government of national defense took power. But the war did not end with the emperor's defeat. It widened into hunger, endurance, and desperation. On September 19, 1870, German forces began the siege of Paris. The city, fortified and proud, became an island. Communication with the outside world nearly vanished. The sense of isolation was total. Balloons carried letters over enemy lines, and one of them carried Léon Gambetta out of the besieged capital. From the countryside, he raised new armies, trying to keep France in the fight. Inside Paris, the siege tightened its grip. Food dwindled, winter arrived. The city's suffering became slow, intimate, and relentless. Stomachs emptying, fires dimming, streets darkening. It is difficult even now to imagine a capital of art and light forced into the arithmetic of survival. Bazaine capitulated at Metz on October 27th, surrendering his intact army and extinguishing one of France's last hopes. Paris fought on through exhaustion. Finally, after months of starvation and bombardment, the city surrendered on January 28, 1871. Even before Paris fell, the new Europe was being announced. On January 18, 1871, while France bled and froze, Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The setting was as deliberate as the politics. The palace of French kings became the birthplace of a German empire. Bismarck had achieved unification through the very forces he believed shaped history most reliably: war, calculation, and pressure. Peace came with the Treaty of Frankfurt on May 10, 1871. France relinquished Alsace and much of Lorraine, paid an enormous indemnity, and endured German occupation of northern provinces until payments were made. The terms were harsh, and they left behind something more dangerous than ruined buildings: a burning national longing for revenge. The years between 1871 and 1914 would be an uneasy pause, heavy with memory. And yet the Franco-Prussian War is not only the story of empires rising and falling, it is also the story of what war does to the human spirit, how it breaks some lives and cracks open others. In the winter of 1870-71, in the small town of Charleville near the Belgian border, a 16-year-old boy watched the war at close range. His name was Arthur Rimbaud. Arthur Rimbaud, 1854-1891, was a French poetic prodigy who transformed modern literature before the age of 20, writing his most revolutionary work as a teenager with a ferocious intelligence and visionary intensity. Born in Charleville to a strict, domineering mother and an absent army officer father, he rebelled early, running away from home, living as a vagabond during the Franco-Prussian War, and immersing himself in the political and artistic turmoil of the Paris Commune. His poems, Le Bateau Ivre, Une Saison en Enfer, and Illuminations, broke with classical form and bourgeois morality, fusing musical language, hallucinatory imagery, mysticism, eroticism, and revolt into a new kind of prophetic voice that sought, in his own words, to reach the unknown by the deliberate disordering of all the senses. After a stormy, destructive relationship with Paul Verlaine, and the creation of works that would later shape symbolism and surrealism, Rimbaud abruptly abandoned literature at 20 and spent the rest of his short life wandering as a trader and explorer in Africa and the Middle East, dying at 37, leaving behind a body of poetry, small in volume but immense in influence, the testament of a youth who burned through language like a comet. On New Year's Eve, the poet's family sheltered at home as Prussian shells pounded the medieval fortress of Mézières across the Meuse. Rimbaud lived amid the war's debris: maimed soldiers, smashed streets, disfigured landscapes. He did not respond like a conventional patriot. He had reason not to. His father, a French army colonel, had deserted the family years earlier. Military glory had already betrayed his household. Rimbaud did not romanticize the war. He stared into it, and in the terrible spectacle, something in him shook loose. He later wrote of flames and smoke rising to heaven, of wealth exploding like thunderbolts. He scorned his brother's eagerness to enlist. After France's defeat, he went around Charleville saying almost provocatively how lucky his country was. Not because he loved suffering, but because the collapse of the old order felt to him like a door opening. Rimbaud was the archetypal provincial youth who had outgrown his town and his family and could hardly breathe inside their expectations. The war externalized what he already carried: fury, restlessness, revolt. That winter he ran away from home. Somewhere in the cold and hunger, along open roads and winter nights, he found a sentence that would haunt and steel him. Weakness or strength, you exist, that is strength. Then, in the spring of 1871, Paris itself erupted. The Paris Commune seized the capital and held it briefly. For a moment, radicals and workers attempted to remake society. Young poets ran through the city's new, feverish atmosphere. Rimbaud, one among thousands of vagabonds drawn to the blaze, went to revolutionary Paris and tasted the rare sensation of a world turned upside down. The Commune was crushed within weeks, bloodily suppressed at the end of May. But Rimbaud carried something away from it: liberation, raw, dangerous, irreversible. He decided to fuse that liberation to his art. The life and the work would become inseparable. On May 13, 1871, he wrote to his friend Paul Demeny that the task was to reach the unknown by disorganizing all the senses, that the suffering would be immense, and that one had to be strong, strong enough to be born a poet. In the wake of war and civil upheaval, his poems became charged with revolutionary turmoil, anti-bourgeois rage, pagan mysticism, and visions that felt like prophecies. His imagination did not soothe, it scorched. Again and again he returned to apocalyptic images: oceans boiling, underground explosions, the planet thrown into violent motion, because that was the world he had seen begin to come apart. So, when we speak of the Franco-Prussian War, we should remember what it truly was. Not a neat sequence of battles, but a turning point where politics, steel, and human lives met. Bismarck used the war to bind states into a nation and to stabilize Germany's position in Europe through diplomacy afterward. Napoleon III gambled on war to rescue prestige and lost an empire. France gained a republic, but paid in humiliation, territory, and grief. Paris endured siege and starvation, and from the rubble, a teenage poet looked at the flames and found not comfort, but a terrible kind of freedom. Bismarck built an empire, Rimbaud shattered language. One unified Germany through strategy and cannon. The other sought the unknown by disorganizing the senses. And so, from the Franco-Prussian War emerged two legacies: the geopolitical order that would lead to world wars, and the poetic revolution that would lead modern literature into uncharted realms. Blood and iron on the battlefield, fire and prophecy in the soul of a 16-year-old poet. This was the war that forged nations and the chaos that gave birth to a new artistic and political reality.